Hello, very beautiful community, micro community. We're going to have a philosophical but also practical conversation about emotional intelligence. There are three kinds of emotional intelligence: psychological, aesthetic, and intellectual. We'll talk about each of them. Now, it's very important that this conversation will feel elitist. And if you have an elitism allergy, you have to put on your helmet and your special gear that helps you not get too triggered, too allergic when you confront elitism. So make sure you're settled in, helmets are on, and then we can go ahead. Now, I'm not straying out of my lane when I say that I don't use the term emotional intelligence as it is conventionally used and as it's used in some of the research literature, because I don't think that emotional intelligence is primarily about self-regulation. When Ricky comes home stressed from work and his partner Susanna handles that well and handles her own feelings of being triggered by Ricky well, that's not emotional intelligence. It's something else that's good, but we're going to talk about that on other occasions, because what I want to say is that emotional intelligence is the capacity to avoid an excess of error about the psychology of other people. That's it. That capacity to see others, or as we'll see shortly, to see their philosophical arguments or to see their aesthetic expressions, is compatible with you having a lot of issues and being really badly regulated. That's why I want to centrally emphasize that emotional intelligence is about seeing other people. Now, we will talk a lot about this when we deal with emotional intelligence on the other channels, because I don't think I want to spend too much time on it here, but that's confidence. You get born with emotional intelligence, but you can also cultivate a degree of it, depending on what you got born with. And we have a crisis in our culture of people through a lack of confidence or through trauma or through psychopathology not being able to use whatever emotional intelligence they do actually have. And my very tiny consulting service, which I do a few hours a month, actually gets people, it's one of 10 things it does perhaps, it gets people to be able to use whatever emotional intelligence they have in these three types of it, which they currently can't use. We have a crisis of this. We have a crisis of this especially in the female population. A lot of women cannot use their emotional intelligence because they're traumatized. But I'm not going to talk about that today because I just want to present what I think the thing is. So let's start with the most basic form of emotional intelligence, and that's what I would call psychological emotional intelligence. Now, they're all psychological, but I just label the first type psychological because it's simply about understanding what's going on in the heads of other people. And that kind of intelligence, emotional intelligence, breaks down into two. Understanding what it's like for Ricky to be in the world and understanding what Ricky is currently feeling. So the latter is Ricky walks into the room and you see that Ricky doesn't want to be there, but he's hiding it. But you can see that, but others can't because Ricky's hiding it well. That's a perception of what emotions Ricky is currently feeling. You could even perceive that Ricky is feeling a degree of self-loathing for making himself go to this place he's arrived at, even though he doesn't really want to be here, and maybe he feels that his better self would make him not attend. Can you see that within 2 minutes of Ricky walking through the door, or can't you? If you can, you've probably got a good degree of psychological emotional intelligence. That's the first part of it. Second part of it is what it's like for Ricky to be in the world. What does Ricky see when Ricky looks inside himself? Does Ricky know how to look inside himself? What happens when he tries and he fails? What kind of experience is that? How does it make him feel? What's the thing that Ricky is permanently struggling with in relationships with others? How much does Ricky really like himself? How confident or insecure is Ricky exactly? What are Ricky's biggest weaknesses and incapacities psychologically? How far is Ricky structured by certain childhood experiences he's had? So here, the two versions can even come together, because Ricky can walk into a room and you can say, oh, Ricky's anxious about being here. But you can also immediately make a judgment about what it's like for Ricky to be in the world. You can say, oh, wow, I'm just seeing out of the corner of my eye this guy, Ricky. He's been standing there for 10 minutes. I think he experienced abuse as a child. I haven't even spoken to him. I can see that. So if you can do that, you have a good degree of ability to use, and you have a good degree of possession of psychological emotional intelligence. You grasp what people are feeling at any moment, and you grasp what it's like for them to be in the world. The two don't always go together. There are some people who are not that good actually at grasping what it's like for somebody to be in the world, but are quite good at grasping what they're currently feeling, and the other way around too. You can grasp really well what it's like to be Ricky, but you can forget the fact that you cannot grasp the fact that Ricky's really unhappy to be at the party he's at. Let's move to the second type of emotional intelligence, and we'll call that aesthetic emotional intelligence. That's emotional intelligence that's to do with understanding human artistic or at least aesthetic expression, right? So you're standing in front of a Mark Rothko painting, and you are perceiving the ambiguity in it. Rothko's canvases are ambiguous. What are the types of ambiguity that Rothko expresses in the canvases? Well, the objects in the canvases stand apart, but they're also coherently part of the entirety of the canvas. They reflect light, light hits them, but they also emit light. Third, ambiguity. The objects are weightless, transparent, ethereal, but at the same time voluminous and solid. That creates a certain psychological impact when the artist's intention is properly realized and conveyed via the canvas to the initiated spectator. And the effect it has is of feeling like you are being held by being dissolved. It's a version of the many kinds of feelings of spiritual elevation that contemporary art achieves. That's how it works with Rothko. Now, if you say, Vlad, look at this yellow over there. What is it? Well, it's this, material you got from Poland together with your chair. It's very nice. It comes from a mid-century furniture shop. This is just as good as Rothko. It's a nice yellow. So shut up about your ambiguity. Shut up about your spiritual elevation. Shut up about your voluminousness and etherealness. You're talking out of your bum. I don't see any of that there. I think it's subjective, and you're a bullshitter. So this is a low emotional intelligence position in the aesthetic realm in relation to the Rothko in front of one. There is then thirdly intellectual emotional intelligence. So let's say a moral philosopher comes along and says, when people refuse to listen to Wilhelm Furtwängler's recordings, he's the greatest conductor of all time, because of his connections, because of his interactions with the Nazis, there's something unhealthy about that. Perhaps not in every case, but there's a risk of something being unhealthy about it, and that takes the form of a certain kind of self-directed emotional aggression, radically prioritizing the moral over the aesthetic in a domain where it's not appropriate to do so, constitutes a form of sort of self-directed violence. I just, stole a point from Nietzsche. Is this right? Can I assess that it's right? But I could come along and say, no, it's bullshit. Ricky just doesn't like Furtwängler because he doesn't like really evil politics. So I don't get what you're talking about with your self-directed aggression. That sounds a little bit pompous. Go back to your philosophy seminar and just sit there. Don't bullshit me. So, right, seeing that or not seeing that as an expression of intellectual emotional intelligence. Now, I think that the easiest emotional intelligence to get born with and maybe cultivate to the highest level is psychological emotional intelligence. A pinnacle of that is more statistically common in humans than aesthetic and intellectual emotional intelligence. However, it's a complex space in which to make these distinctions, because arguably, while what I've just said is true, it's also true that sort of middling level emotional intelligence might be easier to have intellectually and aesthetically than interpersonally. So these are just a couple of remarks of how common this is. Now, we'll talk about the gap in a moment, because it's scary when you don't think you get any of these three things. It's scary to admit that they're real and other people get them, have them, and you don't. And most humans don't have even a middle level of any of the three. So it creates a difficult situation where there's like a small number of humans who are talking about something as though it's real, but you don't get it's real, and the most tempting thing to say, it's not real. It's just not real, right? Which is why when constantly I make judgments on the chat channel and the main channel that have an emotional intelligence quality, including the judgment about what's going on in Trump's mind or even in Putin's mind, often get remarks, nobody can tell such things, right? Because we need either something like scientific evidence or everything else is speculation. And a scientific culture is very tempting to say that. Now, of course, it's also possible to have one of these three and lack the other two in any combination. And often certain experiences we encounter require more than one of these three types of emotional intelligence to be activated. Let's give an example. The pianist Imogen Cooper, who's maybe the leading Schubert player today, once told me that she just has no need to play Beethoven Opus 111, Beethoven's last piano sonata, one of Beethoven's two greatest piano sonatas. And the reason Imogen said that is because as an interpreter, she is much better with first personal emotion than with disembodied emotion. And you get much more first personal emotion in Schubert, which she plays more than anything else, and extremely well. But with most of Beethoven's works, you don't actually get, with most of Beethoven's piano works, you don't actually get first person emotional expression. So of the later sonatas, only Opus 110, the second to last piano sonata, contains a lot of first person emotional expression. And funnily enough, that's a sonata that Imogen has been playing well in recent years. And so the last piano sonata is an expression of a kind of a spiritual ascent upwards that is not a case of an I ascending, it's a case of an ascent happening. You might say it is ascending, but there's not an experience of an individual psychology engaged in an experience. So what have I just done here? Doesn't matter if I'm not wrong about this, but if I'm wrong about this, it doesn't matter, because it's an example that matters. I have linked a psychological emotional intelligence judgment about Imogen with an aesthetic emotional intelligence judgment about Beethoven. Imogen does first personal emotional expression better as a pianist. Beethoven doesn't do, that's emotional intelligence expression of the psychological emotional intelligence kind. Beethoven doesn't do, in his later works, much first personal emotional expression. That's an aesthetic emotional intelligence judgment. Now, all of this creates a problem of a gap. And so the easiest thing to do is just to reject the idea that emotional intelligence in any of these three domains exists. It's all just about making a rational argument, or it's about just subjective experience and so on. So let me just end with a gesture, then a deep explanation of what we do about this gap. It's going to be a little paragraph from a paper that Charles Taylor wrote over half a century ago called Interpretation and the Science of Man. And it's a paper in part about, although that's obviously not Charles Taylor's own way of framing it, but it's a paper in part about intellectual emotional intelligence. I'll read you a paragraph from it. It's called Interpretation and the Sciences of Man. In a hermeneutical science, a certain measure of insight is indispensable, and this insight cannot be communicated by gathering brute data, or initiation and modes of formal reasoning, or some combination of these. It is unformalizable, but this is a scandalous result according to the authoritative conception of science in our tradition, which is shared even by many of those who are highly critical of the approach of mainstream psychology or sociology or political science. So Charles Taylor is not criticizing the natural sciences here. He is criticizing the idea that we should apply the methods of the natural sciences to the social sciences. For it means that this, the social sciences, is not a study in which anyone can engage, regardless of their level of insight. It's a study in which some form of the following claim has to hold. If you don't understand, then your intuitions are at fault, or you are blind or inadequate. Some claims of this form will be justified, that some differences will be non-arbitrable by further evidence, but that each side can only make appeal to deeper insight on the part of the other. This is the most important sentence in this paper, and one of the most important sentences in 20th century philosophy of the social sciences, and I'll read it twice. The superiority of one position over another will thus consist in this, that from the more adequate position one can understand one's own stand and that of the opponent, but not the other way round. Let me read it again. The superiority of one position over another will thus consist in this, that from the more adequate position one can understand one's own stand and that of one's opponent, but not the other way round. It goes without saying that this argument can only have weight for those in the superior position. So let's sum up. Emotional intelligence is a very difficult thing to talk about, and it creates allergy. I don't use the term in a conventional sense. I use it in the sense that's simply about getting the psychological world around you right. It's not much about self-regulation, at least not directly. There are three types. Psychological emotional intelligence. Do I know what Ricky is feeling? Do I know what it's like for Ricky to be in the world? Aesthetic emotional intelligence. What has Ricky expressed on the canvas? What has Ricky expressed on the music score? What has Ricky expressed through his art film? And then there is intellectual emotional intelligence. Are Nietzsche's claims about moral psychology right? Are moral values compatible or incompatible? Are moral values commensurable or incommensurable? These are going to be judgments that require a degree of intellectual emotional intelligence. You can have all on a medium level. You can lack all to any decent level at all. You can have one very high but below on the other two. So that's the beginning of how I frame emotional intelligence, which I think is one of the most important concepts today in social understanding. And it's a concept that gets trampled on easily because of the narcissism in our culture, which says if I can't see something, it doesn't exist, and because of the scientism in our culture, which says that you need formalized, generalizable explanations, various kinds of scientific evidence, otherwise everything is subjective. Now, if that's what you think, then you'd end up with the conclusion that all judgments about um, uh, the social world and all judgments about psychology can eventually become scientific opinions, if not now, 200 years from now. And that, of course, is a ludicrous misunderstanding of what it means to live a life from an embodied, purposive perspective, whereby you go around the world trying to make sense of it as you lead a life in it. Lots of love. Talk soon.